All right, all you APUSH people, let's get back to the grand APUSH timeline by talking about the colonial period. Now, these dates here come from the College Board. They say it goes from 1607 to 1763. But as we set up in the previous video, I think it's a lot easier to break this up. We're going to talk about an early colonial period, a middle colonial period, and a late colonial period as well. Because anything this big, breaking it down makes it a little easier. So let's start in the early colonial period. The beginning, of course, is still 1607, so it's still Jamestown. I choose 1650 as the year that I use because there's this population marker that's reached in 1650. That isn't a magic number. There's nothing that automatically happens once you get 50,000 people. But if you look at a chart of the growth of the colony's population over time, maybe it's got a slope like so, and then in 1650, there's a bit of an inflection point where it starts to go higher. And it's not just about some kind of a change in a slope. It's about an attitude change. That people, when the colonies get this big in terms of population, now see it as something that is actually for real, actually here to stay. Especially in England, there's no longer the attitude of that's where the adventuresome people go. That's where the hardiest people who want to go cut a livelihood out of the forest go. It now becomes just another viable option where people who want to move can go. And so it's seen much more as a regular move that people can make rather than as something that's more on the daring side. So what are the events that we're going to populate this timeline with here? Well, in 1619, we have kind of an ironic pairing. We have the unfortunate occurrence of the, there we go, first slaves that are brought to what is now the United States into Jamestown, setting up the history of slavery that, of course, kind of poisons American history for so long. And then even after it's abolished, we still have another 100 years before the Civil Rights Movement. You don't have to just be the New York Times to trace this story all the way back to those first African slaves that came in. And I mentioned the word ironic before because when you talk about something as oppressive as slavery being coupled with something that's sort of a form of liberty. The House of Burgesses, when it's created in Virginia, kind of like their first House of Representatives, it's the first representative body and form of representative government set up in America. So no longer is there just a governor who gets to make the decisions. Yeah, maybe with a council that advises him, but it's still his decisions. Well, now there is a form of sort of democracy, more technically representative government that is going to be a part of the Virginia system and will be built into the other colonies later on. The next year, you have those wayward folks who were trying to get to Virginia, but who ended up in Massachusetts and end up founding Plymouth Colony. Before they get off the boat, they put together a written document that is considered the first form of self-government in the colonies. This agreement that they make that they know they're outside the boundaries of English law, so they will agree to live together by certain rules and that they will continue to make rules together. That bit is, like I say, called the first bit of self-government in the colonies. Go about 10 years down the road and you have the founding of Boston. Even the National Historical Center says that Boston is the largest and the most prosperous city in the colonies for most of the colonial period. So the founding of Boston is a big deal because even by the time of the Revolution, if you're really looking for a quintessential colonial city in America, it's hard to pick anything other than Boston. About 10 years after that, 1639, we're going to get the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Different than the Mayflower Compact, it is also a written document, but this is considered an agreement for self-government. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, we usually consider the first written constitution in the United States. That this written document is much more like our current Constitution today, a plan for government that actually sets up the way the government was going to operate. So when we talk first Constitution, that's the thing you want to make reference to. And so far along the lines, because it hasn't just been America, there's also been European history going on at the time, we've showed you some things that have popped in to kind of help you orient where does this fit in the European history time frame. Well, in this particular case, the English Civil War is going to be fought during this early colonial period. Sure, it's right at the end, but as you're trying to kind of keep along the parallel tracks of how does colonial history and English history match together, that English Civil War that's then going to lead to the Protectorate and Cromwell, and then in the Middle Colonial Period, it's going to bring back the restoration of King Charles. Well, that whole story is going to get started with like a 7-year civil war that they have that is at the end of the early colonial period. So we're going to take that population 50,000 end marker of this period, and we're going to use it as the beginning marker for the Middle Colonial Period. 1732, I choose that as the end of this Middle Colonial Period because that's when the colony of Georgia is founded. It is the last of the 13 colonies, and so I kind of figure, all right, well, now all 13 colonies exist. We'll call that the ending marker for this period in the Middle Colonies. So what do you need to know from this period? Well, we're going to take a look at 1664. This is when one of the colonizing powers, the Dutch, are basically given the boot and give up the last of their territories. The city of New York, you might remember, is a Dutch territory that then the English take over. We have basically had English, French, Dutch, and Spanish all sniffing around the New World, and the Dutch claim is basically going to end in this Middle Colonial Period. And the taking of New York is obviously a very big thing, as we know from later periods of history how important New York is. Moving a little bit further, Bacon's Rebellion, if you remember the indentured servants who are given through the headright system land after their indenture is over. Well, it happens to be out further west, and out further west is where more Indian attacks happen. And so when they're not feeling like the government in the east is defending them well enough against the Indian attacks, we have Bacon's Rebellion. You might remember I made a little fun of this because historians always say that was the end of indentured servitude. Any economist knows that that's not really true, but the involvement of indentured servants did kind of play a role in all that kind of stuff. So let's see here. We go next to the French explorer La Salle. That's really been kind of the missing piece so far in all this. We've talked about the Spanish, we've talked about the Dutch, but, you know, we live in Illinois, and this is the part of the colonies that was settled by the French. And so coming down from the north, La Salle is going to come down the Mississippi River Valley, founding places like where we live. And so that French piece kind of fits into this timeline through La Salle. Going on a little farther, 1692 are the Salem witch trials. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking the Salem witch trials are earlier than they are. A lot of people have this impression that the Salem witch trials are an early colonial thing. They're not. They're right smack in the middle of the Middle Colonial Period. And it's kind of hard to find things that are big enough to put on the timeline after the Salem witch trials. The second half of the Middle Colonial Period is rather quiet because it's pretty prosperous. And if you remember that term salutary neglect, the British are kind of leaving the colonies to grow on their own. So we're going to finish out this timeline here just by pointing out that the Glorious Revolution shows a little bit why the English kind of had their hands full. That whole story that we remember where James II is booted out and William and Mary are invited to become the monarchs of England, and that makes a power shift from the throne to Parliament because now the king rules by permission of Parliament and not the other way around. That's going to be something that's going to have the British moving along their own path and kind of leaving the colonies be. So let's go to the late period, and then we can finally finish this off. And of course, 1732 we said is the founding of Georgia, and the College Board has decided for us that the French and Indian War ending Well, yeah, they didn't really decide that. They said 1754, which is the beginning of the French and Indian War, but this is my timeline, and I say that it's the end of the French and Indian War in 1763 that I think is a better marker for all this. So, what are the events that you need to know from this period? Well, if you remember the John Peter Zenger case, 1735, I think. This is the freedom of the press court case that became so important in kind of setting up the Americans to go, hey, we have all the natural rights that they're eventually going to be fighting for in the revolution. This case happens early in the late colonial period. That's a bit of an oxymoron. So what also happens, we've got the Stono Rebellion about 4 years later. This is the South Carolina slave revolt where people were able to get freedom if they could escape to Spanish Florida. The Spanish government made the offer that they would free anybody who got there. And so you're going to have people who are enslaved who are making their way ones, twos, dozens at a time. But as the phenomenon grows in South Carolina, there's a great big movement that starts with about 50 or 60 slaves who make an uprising to get themselves down to Florida. It results in a battle that leaves lots of dead both on both sides. And so fear of slave revolts is going to be something that's kind of cemented into Southern mentality because of the Stono Rebellion. If we go a little farther in this period, it's kind of like both earlier and farther. When we talk about the Great Awakening, this is the period that the Great Awakening happens during. And again, people sometimes make the mistake of thinking the Great Awakening is earlier than this. They see it as something that might be middle colonial period. Some even think it's early. But this is actually a late colonial development. It's the 1730s and 1740s. And so you're going to want to have that chronology correctly in your head. And of course, as we've already mentioned, we're going to get to the 1754 of the French and Indian War, which we're going to bring in just a second. But 1754 is also that year of the Albany Plan of Union. Yes, actually written by Benjamin Franklin as the first proposal for, hey, us colonies should be able to rule ourselves. Hey, we colonies, if you really want to be grammatical about it. But this Albany Plan of Union, of course, fails, but it does start to get people thinking about, hey, maybe the colonies should be getting together, like they will during the Revolution. And so, of course, let's bring it back now, the French and Indian War. This is where APUSH says the period ends. This is where I say it ends. But French and Indian War is obviously a huge thing because number one, it's going to push the French out of the New World. And so instead of it being English, Spanish, French, Dutch, and then it's just English, French, Spanish, well, now it's just English, Spanish. That's basically it. But of course, as we all know, the Revolutionary Period, which we're going to talk about next, gets set up by the French and Indian War because it's expensive for the British and they need to find a way to make some more money back. We'll tackle all that next installment of the Revolutionary Period in the Grand APUSH Timeline. See ya.